First, I want to apologize about my voice. I got a sinus infection a couple of days ago. And when you're in radio, you can always say you've got a face for radio and don't have to worry about what you look like, but you need to worry about your voice. Well, I'm kind of screwed in both ways right now, unfortunately. So please don't hold it against me. But I'm really honored to be here, and I'm looking forward to talking to you for the next 17 and a fraction minutes about the ways people are getting involved online and helping other people, particularly when disasters strike. How many of you were on the internet in 1995, 15 years ago? Most of you, okay. I was online then too. I was running an email discussion group called www.edu about the role of the web in education. There are a lot of other groups out there such as EdTech, LMNet, EdNet, all these great places where teachers were talking to each other and engaging in professional development. And sometimes stories would interject themselves into our conversations, and one of those stories happened 15 years ago. That was the Kobe earthquake in Japan, which some of you may remember, January 1995. And I remember on a number of these email discussion lists, people kept asking one basic question: what can I do to help? We could stop talking about education for just a couple of days if we could just figure out what we could do to help. But the reality was there wasn't much we could do. The internet simply wasn't mature yet as a place to respond to a disaster. You had to rely on very traditional methods of responding as a volunteer. You could donate blood. You could go down to the street to a Red Cross shelter and donate blood. Or perhaps you could pick up the phone. You could donate money. But beyond that, there wasn't much you could do in 1995. Or at least at the time, it didn't feel like there was much we could do because we just didn't have enough experience with the internet yet as a way of collaborating during a time of crisis. But we started to see that change not too much longer when we started to be able to donate information in times of crisis, such as September 11th. Now, I was in DC on September 11th, and I was working about 4 blocks away from the White House. And as soon as we heard the Pentagon had been hit, we all got out of there. And for people who didn't live in downtown DC and would normally take the metro, we did a buddy system so they could walk with others so we could just get them away from downtown. And I went to my apartment in DuPont Circle. And sitting there, I felt kind of helpless. So I figured, why not take the skills that I developed simply by interacting with teachers on the internet and create a discussion list where we could just try to hash out what the hell was going on. And so about 2 hours after the attacks, I set up a list called September 11th Info. And next thing I know, messages were flying at about 1 a minute for the next 48 hours, nonstop. And apart from people just trying to figure out what was going on, members of the group were actually trying to sort out fact from fiction. You may remember, for example, there were stories floating around on the news networks in the hours after the attacks that the National Mall in DC had been attacked, as well as the State Department. Well, from my apartment, I was up on the 11th floor, something like that, and I was able to literally look with a pair of binoculars straight down to the State Department in Foggy Bottom. There wasn't any smoke. There wasn't anything. Now, that wasn't necessarily confirming nothing had happened, but at least with various people in the group literally acting as spotters, we could try to hash out whether or not something was happening. And not too long after that, the network started retracting that story because it became pretty clear it was a rumor and it wasn't a fact. And so in groups like this and others that were created that day, people did whatever they could to try to sort out fact from fiction. This is before we started using terms like citizen journalism and network journalism. It's just people using the internet, talking with their friends, trying to figure out what on earth was truly going on. Flash forward a few years to the end of 2004, the Boxing Day tsunami. Once again, people felt rather helpless because not only was there this grave disaster, it had happened halfway around the world, where we really didn't have any reporters who were regularly stationed there. Communications were often cut off, and so many people thought it would take many days before we started finding out truly what was going on the ground. But then a group of bloggers in India got together and created something that became known as the Tsunami Help blog. Just that short period of time from 2001 to 2004, blogs had expanded to the point where it was very easy for anyone to roll out a blog. In this case, they were using blogger.com and add other features such as a wiki to it. And so collaboration was more than just emails going back and forth. There was now a hub where people could share information. They also started collecting information through cell phones, whether people were sending a text message from Sri Lanka or a photo from the southern coast of India. All of this could then be aggregated in one place. And for many days, the Tsunami Help blog became the go-to place for any new information as to what was going on the most remote parts of South Asia that had been affected by the tsunami. 9 months later, we had Katrina. Amazingly, a number of the bloggers from India who had helped set up the Tsunami Help blog stood up and said, "You helped us, what can we do to help you during Katrina?" And they started volunteering as well. And very quickly, a number of projects started developing, also with blogs such as blogger.com. This was one that I did called Katrina Aftermath. I decided that there's no way I could completely write this blog since I wasn't anywhere near Katrina, so I started publishing information on how people could just hack the blog. So they could send it an email, they could record a voicemail and have it posted as a podcast. I let everyone take over the blog, so whatever needed to be shared could be shared. But then the bloggers from India also realized that they thought the wiki would be a real powerful way to coordinate people working on other types of side projects. The most powerful one that came out of it, from my opinion at least, was called Katrina People Finder. If you remember the days following Katrina, people were posting information all over the place online, on blogs, on CNN.com, wherever they could. They were posting information about lost relatives. And at the same time, it took many days for the International Red Cross to roll out a public database for people to report that same information. And so on hundreds and hundreds of sites scattered throughout the internet, you had this information spread out, completely unstructured, but people desperately looking for help. So a group of techies got together under the auspices of this project and decided to create a structure, a database structure that was similar to what the Red Cross would probably be using. And then they got thousands of volunteers, about 4,000 of them, to scour the internet and convert these tragic narratives into the right data structures so they could be assembled into a database and passed off to the Red Cross. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people and people hours put into this, and techies trying to figure out the right data structure. So suddenly the internet had really made a big leap because of this and similar incidents. No longer were people just having to donate blood or money or sharing information online. Suddenly we realized that you could donate something else. You could donate your skills. If you had certain technical skills that could be useful during a crisis, and if the internet was robust enough with the right collaborative tools, suddenly it didn't matter where you were located as long as you could interact with people online and share those skills. And so those techies who got together and created the data structure for the Katrina project, the People Finder project, was a perfect example of how that was becoming a reality. 2008. Once again, it's just a short period of time leaping, only 3 years later. But once again, the internet had matured even more. Social media in particular had become easier than ever before, with tools such as Ning, which makes it possible for anyone to set up their own social network. And so we did just that. We created a site called the Hurricane Information Center, or hurricane08.org. And the purpose of this wasn't to serve as yet another citizen journalism hub, even though that would be perfectly great if we could do that. Instead, this was a collaboration space for techies who were going to build things. 48 hours before Hurricane Gustav came ashore, when everyone thought it was going to be Katrina 2.0, I put out a call on Twitter asking for volunteers with tech skills to come join this community and figure out what on earth we could do to help people in response to the disaster. By the time the hurricane came ashore, 48 hours later, we had 500 people signed up. And this, it just barely scratches the surface of what people were able to do. Some of those volunteers were professional cartographers, and they created maps with information such as evacuation routes from the local governments. They took Red Cross shelter data. They took NOAA data so we could track the hurricanes and other storms the rest of the season. And we overlaid it with all sorts of other information. People built wikis. We had dozens of ham radio operators listening to hams and scanner traffic and transcribing it in chat rooms to make sure if anyone needed help, we could get it to authorities at the right time. And all of this was being coordinated through a do-it-yourself social network that took 15 minutes to launch. Some of the volunteers who participated in that project felt that we need to do better than this because we had this cycle of waiting for something to happen, then getting together and trying to solve some problems with some projects, and then going about our business. And so these volunteers decided to create an event last summer called Crisis Camp DC. I don't know if any of you have been to a bar camp before, but this is a very unstructured conference where you don't plan ahead who's going to talk about what, and you literally sit down the morning of the conference and you map out on a board who's able to talk about what issue and how you're going to talk about it. And so this event gathered a number of those online volunteers with first responders, government agency representatives, aid agency reps, just to start thinking about how can we be better prepared the next time and try to have the right networks in place in case something tragic happens somewhere in the world. Well, it didn't take long. It took about 6 months for the next tragedy to happen. It's just under about 2 months now since Haiti was struck by a devastating earthquake, killing more people than died in the entire Boxing Day tsunami across all of South Asia, somewhere close to 250,000 people. And the same volunteers who organized Crisis Camp quickly got together the morning afterwards and said, what could we do to respond to this? And one of the ideas seemed fairly simple, is let's have another crisis camp. Let's just find some space in Washington, D.C. and tell people to come together, and maybe we can hack some things. 4 days later, when that first crisis camp happened, they were accompanied by 5 other cities, places like New York, Silicon Valley, London, and elsewhere. Because people coordinating and just spreading the word on Twitter, they decided, well, I'm going to host something as well and see what we can build together. So that first week, we had 6 projects, or 6 cities hosting projects. The next week, we had more than a dozen. The week after that, we had closer to 20. There have now been more than 40 crisis camps held all over the world, everywhere from London to New York to Bogota to Wellington, New Zealand, all completely organized with no budget, no structure, except people trying to coordinate online and work together when they can get together in person as well for a few precious hours at a time. Now, it may not seem possible to actually get things done using such a crazy, unstructured method, but that wasn't the case. That first weekend, a group of coders developed the first ever mobile phone app translating Creole to English, English to Creole, and made it available as an iPhone app as well as for Android phones. It wasn't perfect. It couldn't translate full sentences. It was mainly focused on words or phrases, but they did it in 1 weekend. Meanwhile, remember that project I mentioned from Katrina, the People Finder data set? Well, we started scrambling to see if we could renew that project and use it for Haiti, since we knew the same thing was going to happen all over again. And it did, because sites like the New York Times and CNN and others graciously started collecting data, but it was spread out all over the place. Well, it turns out one of the original volunteer developers of this project was now at Google. So he started working with his colleagues, and they created a widget based on the same system that could be placed anywhere on the internet. So news websites started using it, the State Department started using it, and they even opened up something called an API, which made it possible for any software developer to interface with their database. So suddenly it didn't matter when the Red Cross rolled out their system. They were able to roll something out within about a day. And when the Chile earthquake happened last weekend, they were able to roll it out within about an hour. Now it's possible to collect missing persons data anywhere you want to put this widget. But the project I think I'm most proud of is a group involved in something called OpenStreetMap. And this is a group that wanted to create hyper-accurate, high-resolution data after the earthquake in Haiti. This is a screenshot of what it typically looks like when you go to Google Maps or Port-au-Prince. It's fairly basic. You can see the main roads here. There's some squares. You can see where some of the major buildings are. But it's fairly rudimentary. Now, take a look at what OpenStreetMap created. If you were able to zoom in onto this, you could keep zooming and zooming and zooming until you had building by building, alleyway by alleyway accuracy, because they were able to use post-satellite imagery and over 1,000 volunteers learning how to hand sketch using a digital editing tool for maps. This is an open source system that runs like a wiki, so anyone can go to openstreetmap.org and start editing one of these maps. And they were able to put so much data in this, into this map, it resulted in this. This is a really crappy photo, but I don't care how crappy it is, because what you're seeing here is a lieutenant from Fairfax Search and Rescue on the ground in Haiti with our OpenStreetMap data in his GPS device. He was able to take the data and the map that volunteers all over the world put together, and he wrote us a note saying, I wish I had this from day one, because this saved lives. Yeah. Suddenly, social media was no longer people talking about ham sandwiches. It was people working together and collaborating. Even if they weren't very skilled, they were able to put a small amount of time and lead to this. Now, what does this have to do with education? Well, we all know that it's very difficult to interject real-world circumstances, real-world contexts into education, but that's what authentic assessment is all about. And I don't have answers for you, but I do want to pose some suggestions of things that I'd like to see brainstorm further, to see if there's a connection that can be made between the two. For example, one of the projects we created was called crisiswiki.org, which is intended to be a wiki that can serve as a place for collecting data for emergency response and disaster preparedness. And so, for example, here's a collection of links that some people in Chile started to pull together after their earthquake. This is all we have for New York City right now. And so imagine if we had students working together, pulling together whatever information there was regarding emergency preparedness resources for their community and uploading to this system. And God forbid something happened in your community, this would be a place where it could all be found in one place. Similarly, this is a screenshot of what OpenStreetMap looks like for this very neighborhood. Collegiate School's there, so that's a good start, but there's not much here. The possibilities are endless here in terms of what students could input into this, whether it's giving cultural and historical information or showing where local evacuation routes are, snow emergency routes, shelters, anything else that could be added to this. This is something that could be edited right now by teams of students anywhere in the world. Lastly, I wanted to show a project called Ushahidi. Ushahidi is a crisis mapping tool. It's open source. Anyone can deploy it on a server. This is an example that a company called PicNet used in DC during the big snowmageddon we had last month. And it was a very simple setup. What they did was they told people, if you have a problem you want to report in your community, or you're offering some type of willingness to help, post it on here and show exactly where it is. And so other people can track down what needs to be done, and the city government can pay attention as well. This is the kind of thing that can be deployed on any server, including a server hosted by a school or a school district. And so imagine if a school started working with students to pull together maps having to do with their community. It doesn't necessarily even have to do with the disaster preparedness, but it certainly could. How valuable would that be to your community if you were able to offer that to them? How valuable a gift that would be if things hit the fan in your town and people were scrambling to organize information if they suddenly had this to point to. The internet has changed so much in such a short amount of time. 15 years ago, we educators on these email lists could do very, very little except commiserate over the fact that we couldn't volunteer in concrete ways online. And now, all of the things I've shown you are not only possible, they're being done by average people all over the world. What we found is that volunteerism has truly been redefined, and we're the ones that are redefining it. Thank you very much.